You're listening to the Westminster-Canterbury Tales podcast, creating community to foster joy and well-being. Thanks for listening.
We're glad you're here with us today for Tell Me a Story with Ben Fraser at Westminster-Canterbury on the Bay. And today we're actually, remnants of the hurricane are outside. When we planned this, we didn't plan for the hurricane, but it's still there. And you might hear a little bit of the wind, but we're going to go ahead and do this interview anyway. Today we're interviewing Tony Andrew, and we're just delighted to have him with us today. So, Tony, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Right, okay. Tony Andrew. I'm from London, England, and I have been fortunate in that I was trained as an engineer. My father was a mathematician. I became an electronics engineer, and I've spent much of my time in that type of industry. And in addition to that, I've had the opportunity to be able to travel and live around the world extensively. I started traveling back in 1959, went to Africa to live, worked in the jungle in oil exploration for several years, and then I moved back to Europe and enjoyed traveling throughout Europe, both East and part of the West, in the technology industry as it was. And then in 1979, I was intending to move to Iran, but as I think most of you know, I actually got there, but as you know, the Shah was thrown out and all of the Western companies left. But thereafter, I moved to the Middle East as the sales and distribution manager for a major US electronics company, and had the pleasure of getting to know all of the Middle Eastern countries from Egypt up to Turkey, including Israel as well, and spent about a total of 3 or a bit more years there, and moved back to Europe, where I was involved in the .com industry at its birth, so to speak, and also at its death, where I was working for lots of entrepreneurial companies, producing new electronics equipment, helping them distribute or set up distribution channels throughout Europe and Asia. But as I'm sure you all remember, the .com industry crashed. It was a little over ambitious, and things didn't go as expected. But it was nevertheless an extremely interesting period, and the collapse came around about 2000, by which time I was at retirement age and was in the US, living in New Jersey, and for about 14 years I took on an interesting job, which was acting as a job coach for people with disabilities. And that experience triggered me to both learn a great deal more about the nature of their disabilities, which led me to learn, or want to learn, a lot more about human nature, and in turn that led to an examination of my own career, which had been extensive and varied, and I began to have a much better understanding of the nature of human beings' behaviors, the reasons for the types of behaviors, and how in today's very fast-moving, very complex world, we really need to pay attention to what is now called mindset, which is the habits you form which control the way you manage your life, be it in personal or business affairs.
Wow, you've lived all over the world in over 60 countries, is that correct?
I've worked around 65. I've lived for extensive periods in about 12 countries.
Wow. You have a view on life in this world that very few people have. I've traveled in probably 40-some countries, but I've really only lived in one. And so you have an advantage and a perch where you can see the world and human nature that a lot of us don't have. Let's go back. You were born in England, in London itself, or somewhere near there?
Yes, in the suburbs.
Okay,
yes.
in the suburbs of London. And what period of time was that? Was that before the war?
Well, it was before the war. I was born in 1936.
Okay.
So I grew up. I was 9 at the end of the Second World War, and during that period, during the Second World War, I lived in a house in the suburbs of London. Every night I would sleep in a steel cage, which was intended to prevent, if a bomb dropped close by and the house collapsed, it was intended to protect you from the falling debris.
So you do remember the Second World War and what that meant to the people of London and the bombing and all that they went through.
I have vivid memories of looking out of my kitchen door towards the coast, Dover, and the German bombers would come over. They'd fly through the network of barrage balloons, the anti-aircraft guns, etc., the Spitfires. There was a Spitfire base, Royal Air Force base, 20 miles from the house, and they would come up and fight with the German bombers. And sometimes they shoot them down, sometimes they turn and run, sometimes they just drop their bombs and disappear.
Wow.
And then, of course, we had the rockets, the V1s and V2s.
That's right.
And the V1, which was driven by a pulse jet motor, only flew at, I think it was just over 300 miles an hour. It was unmanned, and basically, it was all set up so that when the fuel ran out, it was over London and it would fall, and its load of explosives would do enormous damage.
So, that's something that we don't have in the States. We don't have that memory of the bombings at night that you had in England and particularly in London. And so that's fascinating view. Is that to some extent why your education was in
Well, my father, who won, and I don't quite know when this was, it was in the 1920s, I think, but he won a national mathematics competition. He won the Whitworth Scholarship. Whitworth was one of the engineers that invented a particular thread for bolts, and I don't remember when that was. Probably in the
so the sciences and the mathematics were in your family.
Yes.
And that led to you. What was your area of education?
I was interested in electronics.
Okay.
At 16, I was actually building at home my own crystal set.
Okay.
Now, I don't know if you know what they are nowadays, but then you would have a wire attached to a crystal, which was the detector, so that you could actually transfer, or rather translate, the local amplitude modulated broadcasts to voice.
Yeah, I remember my parents gave me my first one when I was a young man.
Right.
So those crystal sets were fascinating, and of course, all that area exploded, and you've been a part of that all over the world. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your education first?
Well, the education, I had what was then a typically English type of education. I started work at 15 as an indentured apprentice, so I had a 5-year contract with a big telecommunications company, which actually was a subsidiary of a US company. It was called Standard Telephones and Cables in Europe. But the contract was that we'd work and learn for a 5-year period, and they would send us to school. I did what is called a Higher National Certificate in Telecommunications, which was 1 day a week at school for 5 years, and evening school, typically 4 nights a week. I'd have to get to work by 7:15 every morning, except the day I went to school, and I worked through to, I think it was 4:30 p.m. It was an hour to get home or to work, and then I had to do my homework or go to evening school in the evening. So
Wow.
I became accustomed to working long hours and very assiduously. I did all my homework as required, etc. And then at 21, I graduated, and I did another 2 years of higher education, but in specific modules.
Okay.
And in that time, of course, we had the draft then, and I was deferred from being drafted until I finished that educational program.
So after you finished that educational program, if I understand it right, you went on to work in Nigeria.
Yes, my elder brother was drafted. He was a teacher, and after he qualified, he was drafted, spent 2 years in the army, and he told me stories of his experience in the army, and I decided that I didn't think that the army and I would actually be a good fit. So when I was told to go to a medical to make sure I was medically fit for the army, I in fact got on a plane and went to Nigeria.
Okay.
And I stayed there until the draft was finished.
And can you tell us who you were working for then?
I was working for a geophysical company. They used to do seismic surveys, which means that, they were contracted to a large oil company, Shell in this case, and they would map out the contours of the earth in Nigeria using dynamite to send shockwaves down to the different layers in the earth. The shockwaves were reflected back to the surface and picked up by electromagnetic detectors, and the results would be recorded on a long photograph.
And so part of what they were looking for was oil in Nigeria, right?
That's all that they were
That's
looking
all
for.
they're looking for. And of course, you got to spend all your time in big cities without having to go out into the rural areas, or is that right? Or did I have that right?
No, it's exactly the opposite. I spent the
Okay.
whole time, I used to go off for months at a time with a crew of 100 locals, and they would be laying down the cables and the geophones, as they're called, the detectors. One of them was what was called a shooter. He was certified to actually load the dynamite into a pipe which went down typically 40 meters into the soil and detonate it. To put the detonator in and then fire the detonator.
Okay, and so you were overseeing this crew
Yes.
of about 100,
Yeah.
and at one time, one of them tried to kill you. Is that right?
Well, it seemed to be that way. We were walking, most of the area was swampy. It was either completely covered or partially covered with water all the year round. A lot of the other parts of the area were flooded once a year in the rainy season, when it rained every day by almost on the clock. Torrential downpours, and the area would flood, but it would, after a few months, it would dry out, and then the floods would come again. And we're walking through a flood, through a swamp, and one of my crew, from a distance in front of me, was shouting at me and pointing a finger at me, so I thought. And eventually I realized that he was trying to tell me, I didn't understand his language. The 100 people came from 7 tribes, and they were all different languages. And anyway, eventually I looked over my shoulder, and there's someone coming up behind me, standing on the rotting trunk of a tree in the water, and he was raising a machete which had a blade about 18 inches long and about to bring it down on the back of my neck. Now, in college, the only sport I've ever been interested in, I did in fact spend about 3 years learning how to fence. And the machete in my hand was a bit like a sabre, and so I used a sabre-type move and parried the blow, and I survived, sort of thing.
Okay. But
so-
that wasn't all. You had tents, so sometimes you stayed in tents. A lot of times you couldn't even stay in a tent, right?
Well, if we were on dry land and it was easy to carry things, because this crew was carrying what we ate, what we dressed in, which wasn't very much, a pair of shorts, and all the dynamite, we used 300 or 400 pounds a day, so there was quite a bit to be carried. The technical equipment, cables which were 100 meters long, 2 of them on either side of the point at which the dynamite was exploded, and then all the electronic equipment.
So let me get this right. You were hiking. You weren't driving through. Maybe there was some driving, but most of it was hiking, right?
Oh, it was all hiking.
Okay.
There were no roads. In some places there were no footpaths, because who wants to walk through swamp all the time?
And there must have been mosquitoes. I go to Tanzania or Kenya quite often, and I try to go in the winter, so there's not as many mosquitoes. But if it's summer, there's mosquitoes there.
Yes, in some places there were not too many. In other places, I remember a couple of places where every time I closed my eye, mosquitoes would be caught up in the eyebrows. That was extreme, but that did happen sometimes.
And there was even time when you had to tie yourself to a tree to sleep at night. I
Well,
thought that is fascinating. I don't know if I could sleep that way.
Well, if there's nothing but water underneath you and there's a tree, that's the easiest place to sleep, because there was no question of going home at night. It was too far. And it was difficult to move anyway. I mean, we might move 10 kilometers a day in a reasonable swamp, but there were some swamps where you struggled to even stand up because the soil was so soft.
Why swamps?
It was the Niger Delta, and the subsurface, the crust of the earth, happened to have various geological structures which allowed oil. And remember, oil came, I've forgotten how many million years ago, but it was the rotting forests that created the oil. And the oil would get caught, trapped underneath layers of rock. And if they were in, for example, a dome, then it stuck there.
Okay.
Couldn't get out unless you drilled into it and pumped it out.
So did they find oil?
Yes. One time, quite a few years ago, Nigeria, it may still be, it was a major oil producer. It wasn't quite as productive as some of the Middle East countries,
Right.
but it was a significant provider.
So how long were you there in Nigeria doing this?
I was there for 2.5 years.
Oh, my. You had to be a young man at that time, because I don't think I could go more than a day doing
Well,
what you were
when
doing.
I got there, I was 23.
Okay.
And when I left, I was about 50, yes.
That's great. So after 2.5 years, you figured you had enough of that. You went on to Ireland, I believe.
Well, yes, we had sort of contracts because you didn't want to stay there too long, 2.5 years. And I returned back to my company in the UK, which was an American company. And they then sent me to Ireland with a new technology. It was the same oil prospecting objective, but the process was a little different. We used to run along roads in towns and things.
Okay.
And would vibrate a heavy weight on the surface and do the same type of measurement.
Well, it was developing too, the technology,
Yes.
and you could drive, which you couldn't do that in swamps very easily,
Right.
I don't think, at
Right.
that time. All right, so you were there for a brief period of time. Tell us,
About 9 months, I think.
Yeah. So then you went to Europe into electronic measurements and sales and that sort of stuff.
Well, I worked for Hewlett-Packard for, I think, about 15 or more years. and a number of other companies, both before and after, who were in making competitive equipment, in other words, electronic measuring equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And I also became a specialist in what is known as the Fourier transform, analysis of vibration. It's used in analysis of vibration.
Wow.
At that time, it was an HP was a big thing in the analysis of vibration in testing aircraft.
Okay.
The Concorde, for example.
Sure.
Nuclear submarines, nuclear power stations, that type of thing. Because the vibration has disastrous effects, or can have disastrous effects, so you really need to know what's going on. And it took this type of fast Fourier transform to be able to measure and calculate what was happening.
And did you learn some of this just by working in the field? Is that correct?
Well, my education included things like Fourier transform, which was a standard formula in electronics. But this was a question of an application for it.
After you worked there for several years, and then that's true, for 15 years or so, you moved on to, is it Iran? Yeah.
Well, yes, that was actually with Hewlett-Packard, and I went out to Iran basically to see whether I wanted to work there, sort of thing. But it didn't matter whether I did or not, because basically the Shah was overthrown, and all Westerners got out.
Yeah, and so you were...
But then I went back to the UK, and then shortly afterwards I was appointed the sales manager for the Middle East and Africa. So I went back to... Well, actually, I had a regional office in Athens.
Wow.
My family and I had a home in Athens for 3 years.
Okay.
And but I was constantly travelling to the Middle East, and mostly to North Africa to start with, and then later on I got more involved in southern and eastern Africa.
Now, that's French-speaking Africa for the most part, North Africa?
Well, Arabic.
Arabic, okay.
Yes, Morocco, through Libya, etc., or Italian as well.
Yeah.
To Egypt, which is English.
Yes.
Correction. It's primarily Arabic, but English is the first language, a second language rather. Yeah.
Yeah. And how was that period working in the Middle East and Africa?
It was very interesting, but obviously it was very different to what I'd been doing in Europe and living in Nigeria in the jungle, because the cultures are so different. The way people operate, the way they think, the way they conduct business is very different, and you have the different competing religions in the area.
Yeah.
And some of the Iraq was a dictatorship. Actually, in different ways, they were all dictatorships.
Well, negotiating the various countries and people groups that you had to deal with, from Nigeria to Egypt to Iran and North Africa, very, very different. So you had to have some flexibility and be a quick study and a quick learn in order to do that, because those cultures, the cultural challenges there are immense.
They are.
Yeah.
But if I may add a little interesting point.
Please.
We have to remember that these three great religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, all started in that part of the world.
Yeah.
They all worship the same God. To your point, the issue is that I was incredibly adaptable, and you could put me anywhere and I'd find a way of surviving, sort of thing. But it's not enough, because you have to develop a mindset, the habits required to say, okay, I'm going here, Saudi. First trip.
Yeah.
What do I need to know about Saudi? Their culture, their economy,
Mm-hmm.
why I'm going there,
Yeah.
and simple things like, well, when I get off the plane, what do I do? Now, the obvious answer to everybody is, well, you get a taxi. Well, okay, I remember one night I got off a plane in Riyadh. Well, never mind where it was. It was, Riyadh. It was late at night. I got into a taxi, and I'd been there before. We were going to one of the big American, something like the Marriott Hotel,
Right.
which was on the suburbs of the city.
Sure.
And the taxi driver didn't know where it was. To cut a long story short, I eventually persuaded him to let me drive the taxi
Oh, my.
because I knew it better than he did.
Wow.
And that's the sort of thing that happens.
There's some cities would not want to drive in.
Well, I would agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can think of one in particular,
Yeah.
which
Because
was,
everybody has a different. I notice when I travel how people use their horns in different countries
Yes.
and different cultures, and they use them for. I was in India, I think it was, and we got in late at night, and people. There was a road with nobody on it. Well, won't say nobody on it. In India, people are all over, but there was no other cars really, and they would still be honking, and I'm not really sure why they were honking. And of course, in the States, we honk occasionally, but not very often. You don't use your horn very often. But other countries, they use it all the time, and they communicate something back and forth. I'm not always sure what it was. So, anyway, driving in different countries is a challenge. But good for you to be able to do that and find your way there to your hotel.
well, the worst experience I've had is actually in Saigon in Vietnam.
Oh, really?
And there, 2 or 3 times, we had what they called, the taxis were typically deux chevaux, 2 CVs. They were made in France because it was a French colony.
Okay.
And a little tiny car, and I'd be crouched up in the back seat. And on 2 or 3 occasions, it was hot, windows were open, no air conditioning. Someone sticks a handgun through the window.
Oh, my.
And that becomes a problem.
Yeah, I guess so. They say for women to keep their purses, I guess, on the floor and right in front of them or something like that. But because sometimes people grab, but this is even worse. They just pull the gun in the window.
Right.
And it's someone that hasn't traveled a lot may not realize that in some of these cities, there's so many people on the road and on the street that it's you're not going very fast because there's just way too much traffic and way too many people.
Yes.
And so well, that's amazing that you could function so well in so many different cultures.
As the key is that you have to train your mind to learn to cope with that situation. And there are things that you need to find out when you get there. Makes it a lot easier.
Now, after you worked in Africa and the Middle East for a while, you eventually moved to work for .com organization, right?
Well, there was
Company.
There were a lot of. It was the .com trend.
Okay.
It was a period when enormous amounts of money was invested in startup companies designing and producing new electronic toys. And eventually, in the 2000 period, it collapsed. It financially collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was 65 at the time, and I got thrown out on the streets sort of thing because all the companies around me were collapsing and no one wanted to know me in terms of a new job.
Oh, yeah.
Because the .com had a certain negative connotation.
We live in a world that changes quickly.
Yes.
When I was and you and I were children, you had one job, or your parents had. A lot of times you'd get a job and you'd do that the rest of your life and then you retire.
Right.
But that's not true anymore, and particularly for the generation that's now beginning to go into the workplace. they may not stay at a job for more than 3 or 4 years and then transfer to another one. And
Well, I think a large number of jobs change the nature of the work involved in 3 or 4 years.
yeah,
And nowadays, if the young people or even older people, if they're not looking ahead all the time to see what changes are coming and how they fit into the picture, which includes whether or not they're willing to adjust, maybe obtain more skills. Certainly they need to develop an understanding of what's moving and how they need to move with it
yeah.
in order to succeed.
Yeah, in this electronic age, it's not only the gadgets that change, but the software that changes, and you have to learn new software over and over again, and all that kind of stuff.
That's true, but I think that the issue is that if you look at retail
Yes.
now, I don't know what percentage of their business is now done online.
Yes.
And that's only been in the last, 10, 20 years
That's
sort
right.
of thing.
That's right.
And so they actually employ people now specifically to handle online orders.
Yeah.
They didn't 10 years ago.
Tremendous influence of Amazon as a forerunner in
Yes.
that. Yeah.
And you look at clerical work.
Yeah.
Who holds paper folders nowadays?
I do.
Well, so do I.
But
I've got.
I'm a dinosaur in that area. I remember when I started teaching, you would write your syllabus out. People would still write in those days, longhand, and you'd give it to your secretary, and she would type it up for you, or maybe it would be a secretary that worked for 4 or 5 faculty members. That doesn't happen anymore. No. Everybody does their own syllabus, and of course you do it. You don't write anything out. You type it out, and you use your computer. You just redo the last one, or take a model and bring it in and massage it until you get it right. But that whole idea has really changed of how that job level of being a secretary for a group of people or for a person has changed a lot. So you worked for a .com for a while. Where was that? Mainly in Europe and Asia, is that right?
Well, when you're talking about I work for a .com, what type of company are you thinking of?
Well, I'm thinking of probably something like, I don't know, Hewlett-Packard maybe, or maybe Microsoft would probably be more, because you're talking about the software rather than the hardware.
Well, now, of course, obviously Microsoft is a major producer of software.
Right.
Obviously, their operating systems, their networking systems, but now they go more and more, I think, into application programs.
Right.
You know, every company today, small or large, has some sort of accounting software, but some of those are with their big companies, their major computer programs, and they write them themselves, but less and less probably today. Inventory, for example, communicating with the customers, support desks, this type of thing. Now, you can look at them as .coms, but they're just part of the functioning of the company.
Okay.
That's electronics. You can't support your customers today, you can't even sell to them without electronic communication.
That's right.
And so in a sense, it's a .com world.
Yeah.
It's certainly an internet world, and of course now you've got the issue of the computing in the cloud.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's all part of the change. That's a major business.
As we approach this last area of your life where you spent several years as a job coach, you've made a large transition from a young man, 23 years old, going to Nigeria to look for oil, through all these other organizations and work in Asia and Africa, Middle East, Ireland, and so eventually you found your way here to the States. And tell us a little bit about this job coach and how you got into that.
Well, as I said earlier, I was essentially ejected from the the technology industry age. I think there's an element, of course, about what we were talking about just now, and that is that the industry perceived that I had fallen behind in the technology. That's one element. The other element is that I didn't go looking for that. The job was suggested to me by somebody, and I thought, oh, interesting, I'll try it. It wasn't paid particularly well compared to my past experience, but it's interesting, I'll try it. And I very quickly came to really enjoy it, in the sense that I got a great deal of satisfaction out of helping people with disabilities. I got on well with them, and I started to learn or research extensively into the typical disabilities. And eventually...
Now, when you're talking about disabilities, that can mean a lot of things. What kind of disabilities are we talking about?
Well, autism
Okay.
is one of the common...
Sure. Someone would be very,
stuff.
very smart and yet be
Yes.
autistic, which limits them in some ways.
Yes. And there are several which I just can't... They don't
Sure.
come to mind at the
Right.
moment. But the fundamental issue is that in learning how to help them, which included not just learning about the disability, it was how to help them. And it turned out that how to help them was really just a factor of understanding humanity. And if you look at everybody around you, you can see normal people, and they've got a touch of autism. They've got a touch of this, they've got a touch of that. And so I started to see these people as being people who were not something from outside the world. They were people who just had a little too much of this or that characteristic. And if you approach them as people and learn how to communicate with them with particular reference to how to address their particular problem, you could make progress. It became satisfying, and not only that, I began to look at myself in this way, and I looked at my past life and began to recognize periods when I'd been successful and other periods when I was not so successful, and I began to realize that the success periods could be explained and the lack of success could be explained. Now that means that if you stop and look at yourself and say, I want to do this, but for some reason I can't get there, then go back and analyze what skills, capabilities does this require? What have I got? What can I change? In other words, what type of skills can I enhance? What behaviors can I change that will enable me to reach my goal? And this all comes out of my growing interest in how we humans think and how we behave.
Ken, and you may not be able to do this, but it just comes to me that it'd be great if you had one example, without any names or anything. There's somebody in your job coaching that you helped and you kind of get a breakthrough.
Well, if I go back to the issue of the guy that tried to possibly cut my head off sort of thing, I'd only been there a couple of weeks. I couldn't even tell you where the country was on a map at the time. I was so ignorant of what was going on, both in terms of the culture, the multiple cultures, the terrain, etc., etc. But it made me realize very quickly, I need to understand what's going on here. I need to understand what's motivating these people, why they're working for me, type of thing. Do they like working for me? How do I get a better relationship to understand they're living with me? And sometimes we would be living in or near villages, and they would have relationships, or they come from the village. And the problem was that language was a very big issue. Mm-hmm. Some of them spoke some English. But when we spoke in English together, I couldn't formulate a complex question in a manner that they would understand. Because I'll give you an example. I was standing on the beach with 2 or 3 of my crew one day. A plane, this is on the Atlantic, mm-hmm. plane comes over. And one of them turns to me and looks at me and said, "Did you come on one of those?" "Yes, I did." "And what's over there?" And he's pointing out into the Atlantic Ocean. Mm-hmm. "Well, if you go far enough, there's America." Mm-hmm. What's America? Yeah. It's an issue of learning what their interests are. The point that I was going to make was that I couldn't ask questions, A, because there was a language issue, and B, in the sense that we didn't speak the same mm-hmm. language, and B, because even if we did speak the same language, we had such different terms of references.
That's right.
And so I couldn't get the answers to the questions I asked. They didn't understand my questions.
Yeah.
And so what I did was to learn how to use body language. Mm. And that enabled me to learn who was a top dog, who was the chief, who was a middle ranker, mm-hmm. who was an outsider. Mm. By just looking at the way they talked to each other, if they did, or if they passed each other in the bush, how did their bodies react? I mean, it typically, when the headman walks down the street or around the path, the mid-rankers, they don't exactly bow, but they nod their head, they look, their posture exhibits respect mm-hmm. for the person. Mm-hmm. Whereas if it's an outsider, the body language exhibits hostility. Mm. I don't want to know you. I don't think you're not my chief. Mm-hmm. I'm independent, sort of thing. Where else have I heard that? And in time, it takes time, mm-hmm. weeks, you can get a pretty good idea of the status of each individual. And obviously individuals change, situations change, and you have to keep adjusting your assessments, but you get more skilled at it then. Mm. And then most of the tribes have slightly different facial characteristics, mm-hmm. so you can pick out the different tribes more easily. But then you start to get the understanding based on the body language that, well, this tribe is more important, stronger than this tribe. Mm-hmm. And this is a little group of people, they're sort of hangers-on. Mm-hmm. They have no authority anywhere. Within the group, there is an authority structure. Mm-hmm. So you've got within the tribe and between the tribe structures, and you can work all this out. It takes time.
Sure.
And
did you become friends with any of them? I mean, closer to some than others?
Yes.
That you could trust?
Oh, yes, definitely, okay. Yes. Okay. And you get the feeling of trust is exhibited in body language.
Okay.
Also, that body language includes positioning. So if you're trying to get something done, I knew this guy, typically the top people had some English.
Right.
And so you could converse with them in part. Mm-hmm. But you start to give them authority, well, what I want you to get done for me is this. I want these mm-hmm. 10 boxes of dynamite moved from A to B. That type of thing. It's possible for them to do it. It's just a question of giving them directions. It was better for one of them to give the other directions mm-hmm. than it was for me. So I mm-hmm. picked a number of people who I gave them directions, which gave them authority, prestige, and they would get things done for me.
Yeah.
And that would leave me time to learn more body language type of thing, because it takes time.
Yeah. If you were somehow in a time capsule and you were advising your younger self, what would you tell them?
Well, it's very clear to me that I did not take control of my life sufficiently, in the sense that I set goals, business goals, personal goals, and produce a plan of action which would enable me to get from here to there, type of thing. And I didn't spend enough time understanding or learning what was happening in the industry or the job that I was in. What was changing? What did I need to change in order to keep up with or even ahead of those industry changes? That would have put me in a lot better position. The other thing is that I mentioned, I think, when I was a child in the World War II, I lived a somewhat constrained life. But in retrospect, I can see that I had a personality which was a little restrained. I was able to adapt to situations easily. So you need to have a flexibility of mind which enables you to look at what's going on around you and make real decisions about what you should do to make sure that you continue on a positive stream rather than fall off the edge of the cliff type of thing.
Yeah.
And this is, again, the mindset issue. Habits, mental habits, where you see a situation, whatever it is, and you stop and think, oh, what does that mean? What's happening there? Why is it happening? Who's making it happening? How are they making it happen? What should my involvement in this be to my advantage? And the problem is that what I did and what a lot of people do is that they see something and they automatically react. It's like an emotional reaction, and they're basing their opinion, the way they're thinking, on a set of assumptions, and which assumptions are very often wrong. If you're driving in a car and someone steps out in front of you, you automatically step on the brake. That's an automatic emotional reaction, and that's good. But if you are in a job and a new manager comes in and he's got a set of different priorities and you just carry on as you are, that's called suicide. And you need to be able to recognize the difference in his priorities, recognize or work out the potential impact on you. Is it good? Is it bad? It's likely to be bad. What are you going to do about it? So you develop an action plan. So for me to make this change to myself, I've got to do this. I've got to learn something about this particular technology. I've got to learn a new process. I've got to establish a better relationship with somebody. And that's the other thing. I was too independent, and although I got on well with people, I didn't get strong relationships. And so when they came to appoint a successor to themselves, whatever, they didn't think of me. I was promoted a number of times.
Sure.
But I think it was more because I was there than because I was the right person for the job. And that all comes down to our personalities, how we communicate, how we interact with people. That process, I call it a process, is developing a procedure in your mind, a process in your mind, where something happens, you think about it. What are my goals? What are their goals? How do I change myself to achieve what has to be achieved? And that means you have to change the way you think. That's very difficult.
Yeah. Now you've seen business, societies, many societies, the world go through a lot of changes in your lifetime. Starting at, say, when you started your education in your early 20s and then your first job at 23. And now today, very, very different. What is the difference?
Well, I think fundamentally, compared to after the Second World War, we have lost our social skills. We don't think of ourselves as a community. We think of ourselves as individuals with rights. Mm-hmm. I am free. I can do this. I can do that. And this and that isn't always good for the community. It's too individualistic. It's too self-centered. To my mind, and this sort of comes back to what I was talking about earlier, where I had to learn how the crew lived and thought of each other, and et cetera, how they related to each other. We don't do that, or we do that very badly today. And things are not going to get better until we start to recognize that we're in a community, there are certain common interests, and we all have to work towards those common interests. It's an issue of looking at the common versus the extreme interests, the outsiders. We've got to look after the community first. It's got to be, we've got to have a good set of laws, we've got to apply the laws, we've got to be fair to people, we've got to give people opportunities, help them, and at the same time develop, or I said, give them opportunities, in other words.
Now, changes in religion, changes in job, changes primarily technology, because technology plays a much bigger part in the younger generation's life than it did in yours and mine when we were starting out. How much do you think maybe can be attributed to that?
Well, I think with the advent of modern technology, it is very easy for a young person to basically lose themselves in whatever is their technology is telling them, social media. And I think that it is up to our parents and the education system to start doing a better job of teaching children what is a community, for example. How do you behave in communities? Teaching them the bigger picture of the components of a good community. And a community can be a nation, not just part of it.
And this sort of gets at what you said in the last few years. You've been fascinated with human nature and what makes us human and what is our nature and what's the common thread that goes through human nature. And maybe what it is what Martin Buber talked about, the I-thou, that we are made to be in relationship with other people.
Basically, I think human beings prefer to be in a relationship or have people around them that have common interests and will work together for a common cause. In other words, a community. But human nature, in my opinion, was actually formulated tens of thousands of years ago when we were very, very primitive. And Maslow's triangle of needs, pyramid of needs, is the fundamental issue. But we're all born with certain personalities and characteristics, human nature, and that the issue of food, housing, security is fundamental to human nature. We all need that. But then you start going up the pyramid and you're starting to look for a community spirit. The other things, food, housing, security, are survival instincts. But now we're starting to get above that into the community, where you are contributing voluntarily to the survival, the well-being of the community. You're not trying to stay alive. You've already taken care of that. Now you're trying to make the community a good place to live. And I really don't think that we teach our young people the basics of what I've just described, and how to develop their instincts. The young people today, I think, I understand, they're too self-willed, they're too self-interested, and that's got to be calmed down. And okay, well, what am I doing to help the people around me?
Well, they spend so much time with mediated communication. They
Yes.
don't do a lot of face-to-face communication. And I like your illustration of Maslow hierarchy of needs. Well, Tony, this has been a great conversation. I want to thank you for spending this hour with us today.
I thank you.
Is there anything else you want to say before we sign off?
The only thing I want to say is that I would like to see young people get really serious about taking control of their lives in a good way, becoming more proactive and building their careers, not just waiting for the wind to blow them in a favourable direction, because the winds are very unpredictable.
That's true. Well, thank you very much, and that's all for this time. We'll hope you'll listen to us again next time, and we come back with Tell Me a Story.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Westminster-Canterbury Tales podcast. Thank you for listening.